Now, normally taxes and school budgets are pretty dry subjects, but for my panelists today, who have either been covering the political firestorm over these two measures or directly in the thick of it, nothing could be further from the truth. Joining me now are Arun Ramanathan, Executive Director of Education Trust West, Jill Tucker, Education Reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, Freedberg, Executive Director of EdSource, and California Senate President Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg. Thank you for joining me. So, Arun, explain to me exactly what Proposition 38 does.
So, you know, what we saw in the film was depressingly familiar. Before I joined the Education Trust West, and we're a statewide education civil rights organization, I was in San Diego Unified School District, and so you could see the budget cuts year after year rippling through our schools and our classrooms. And so what's really at stake when we think about the future is not just our education system, not just our K-12 system, but the economy of our state and our state's future. And what Proposition 38 does is it reinvests in our K-12 system, and our preschool system, for 12 years, on an average $10 billion a year. And that would actually restore all the cuts that have been slashing through our education system for the last 5 years. Now that money is protected. It can't be taken by Sacramento. It can't be used for other purposes. It has to go to schools, and then it gives folks at the school level the ability to make decisions about how to use that money. So not folks in Sacramento, not administrators in districts, but it gives folks down at the school level. And that's $10 billion a year that can be used to restore arts, music, PE, extend the school year, all of the things that have been cut from our schools and school districts.
But that's not really going to help with this year, correct?
No, actually it would help with this year. Some of the money will flow in this year. Some of the money can be used to offset the cuts that would be projected in this year, and some of the money can also be used to offset the cuts that would be projected in the higher education system. And the thing about that is, again, this is protected revenue. It's not flowing into Prop 98. It's money that's outside of the money that's ordinarily set aside for the schools. So right now, if we're 47th, what this would do is actually bring us, which is sort of sad, to the average nationally. And it would do that for 12 years. So really address this in the long term.
So Jill, you've been working in schools and seeing the cuts firsthand. Can you talk a little bit about that? What have you seen firsthand?
You know, we have seen, as Arun said, that cuts across everything. We have seen summer school virtually eliminated. We have seen class sizes increase to 35 students or more. You are seeing layoffs. I think that it's about 30,000 teachers laid off. But, you know, all those things that we took for granted when I was growing up, pre-Prop 13, you know, art and music and libraries and all of those things, most of those things are gone now, and they are poised, which, you know, I remember last year so many educators and principals and school district people said, this is it, we have nothing left to cut. And then we get to this year where they're poised to, if Prop 30 doesn't pass, for example, to face $5 million in cuts, and they're talking about now decreasing the school year. Many districts would have to cut at least a week off or even more at the end of the school year, and find, you know, get rid of personnel, custodians, anybody who they can. So it really is, you know, it's a different school system than people might remember from, you know, 20, 30 years ago.
And so Proposition 30 is looking to answer those questions as well. Explain to us, Senator, how that works.
Sure. Thank you, Al. Well, first of all, it's important to point out that Proposition 30 and 38 cannot exist together. If both were to pass, the one with the most votes would win, and they're in conflict. And so the voters need to make a choice. And I strongly support Proposition 30. And I do so because I've been the leader of the state Senate since 2009. And in 2009, because of the Wall Street crash, the excess of Wall Street, our state was faced with a $42 billion budget deficit. Over the last 4 years, the legislature and 2 governors have chipped away at this deficit from 42 to 26 to $19 billion, and now we're almost to the end of it. And all parts of public service, especially public education, have been hit very, very hard. But it's not just K-12. It's all three segments of the higher education system. It's the safety net for people most in need. We've completely eliminated dental care and dental assistance for low-income adults, for example. Now, if Prop 30 fails, or if Prop 38 gets more votes than Prop 30, what will happen is very clear. There will be almost $6 billion worth of automatic cuts to K-12 education, higher education, and other public services. And the money that Arun talks about under Prop 38 will not even kick in until after the 2 to 3 weeks of the school year have already been lopped off this particular academic year. And in addition, the state budget deficit will continue to linger at a number of between $3 and $5 billion. Proposition 30 gives Californians the opportunity to end one very painful era in California and begin a new and a better chapter. And finally, as much as we all desperately want to add funding for public education, you can't add funding until you have a balanced budget. And that's our opportunity here with passing Proposition 30.
Let me ask you, though, why would the legislature sort of pass the buck on to the average Californian to vote on this? Why wouldn't just in the budget process you figure this out?
It's a fair question, and the reason is very clear. To raise taxes in California through the legislature requires a 2/3 supermajority vote. Democrats in California, in both houses of the legislature, have strong majorities, but not yet a 2/3. We're trying on November 6th as the Senate to get a 2/3 supermajority, and we have a good chance of doing so. But up to now, the Republicans most who have signed the Grover Nordquist pledge, saying that they would never raise taxes under any circumstances, refused to vote for taxes. It happened one time in 2009, the first year when the deficit was $42 billion. 6 Republicans voted for taxes. The 2 leaders were thrown out of their leadership positions, one at 1 in the morning of the vote, the other several weeks later. So we have not been able to muster the 2/3 supermajority. That's why Governor Brown decided to go directly through the initiative process to the people.
Louis, all of this sounds pretty complicated, even for people who understand where everything's going. I saw graphs with buckets and moving money and all sorts of stuff like that. And I'm just wondering, how do you think the average Californian takes all this stuff?
Well, that's part of the problem. One of the most complicated issues, I'd say probably the most complicated public policy issue in California is school finance. There's a handful of people in California who understand it, I'd say at best. And so now what we are asking the voters to be essentially public policy experts to make sense of a system, to vote on an issue that is extremely complicated. And then on top of that, we have an extremely unfortunate situation where we've got these 2 competing initiatives on basically people trying to do similar things. To understand the differences between these 2 and the similarities are extremely complicated. We went through it at EdSource, talking to every conceivable expert, and there's all differences about how much money it's going to raise, when it kicks in, is it this year, is it next year? And so we have this is really a potentially disastrous, because if people are confused, every political expert will tell you they will vote against the proposition at the ballot box.
And I will say, too, I find this is really interesting, because I get a lot of comments and emails from parents going, help me, what do I do? Which one do I vote for? Do I vote for either one or both? And I find it interesting because you have very strong, right here at our tables, advocates for public education. These are people who work hand in hand, the PTA and the Democrats. The PTA is behind the Proposition 38, and you have the CTA and the teachers union and all sorts of school districts and people who have been fighting for education supporting Prop 30. And so parents are looking at people that they have trusted to be advocates for education now at opposite ends. And I think it makes it, not only is it complicated, but it makes it incredibly difficult to figure out, well, who do I abandon? This person that I like and I trust, or this person that I like and I trust.
Go ahead, Arun.
Yeah, Arun.
Well, I personally think it's sort of sad that we're in this situation. The economic imperative is clear. We're going to need 5.5 million new college graduates by 2025 in this state. And so The notion is that we as Californians need to invest in our K-12 system to get to that goal. Now, the public policy question really is, how do you get to that point? You're not going to get to that point by the status quo. You're not going to get to that point by staying 47th in the nation in education spending. And just as in terms of strategy, when I look at 30, saying we're going to lop off $6 billion from the education system if you don't vote for something doesn't seem to be the best of all strategies. Presenting a productive vision for the future, which is what 38 does, I think is the right way to go.
Well, I agree with you, but that's where we are right now.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where we are.
And respectfully, you have the luxury of not having to make choices between K-12 education, higher education, and other vital public services. Governor Brown does. The elected legislators do. And I think that's a big difference. Molly Munger, for example, I think is very well intended. Prop 38 is well intended. I could see myself supporting it at another time. But Governor Brown was elected in 2010 by an overwhelming margin, outspent by Meg Whitman. Now, it doesn't mean that he's a king or that any of us are, have our final say, but he puts a balanced tax measure before the voters, Proposition 30, that helps public education, but also balances the budget. You expect the other side, the Taxpayers Association and the Republicans, to oppose it, but you don't expect it from Ms. Munger. And I must say, the only reason she can do this is because she's a wealthy person who can write a big check. Now, I kind of go back to the basics of representative government. We're imperfect, no question about it. But in choosing between the two, I ask voters to look at two things. Number one, the fact that Prop 30 balances the budget and helps education, but also the Munger initiative in some ways represents to me the initiative process run amok. We have to make choices here, and 30 is the better choice.
Can I just clarify one thing? That people can vote for both. And in fact, there are many organizations like the California School Board Association who say that you should vote for both, because if you split your vote to get that 50% majority, it only needs a simple majority for one of these to pass. And whichever one passes, whichever one gets the most votes, that one is the one that basically becomes the law. So people actually don't have to choose.
Sure. Arun, did you want to respond to what the senator said?
Well, again, I mean, when you're looking at these initiatives, the question is which one projects a productive and positive vision of the future? And the way that they've taken 30 essentially is to say, in a budget, right, our California budget, about 50% is education. But all the cuts, 100% of the cuts are going to come from public education. Now, that doesn't necessarily make sense. And again, when you look at Sacramento, and there are a lot of great and deeply honorable folks in Sacramento, like the senator, but what they have done over the last few years is increase funding for the prison system while they've been cutting the heck out of the schools. So, again, when you have an option of fixing what is truly a fundamental problem for our state, which is our education system, from my perspective, 38 is a better option. Now, I'm not saying that, for folks who are voting for both, that is a perfectly good option too, but this is the one that presents a vision of the future that is positive.
Let me just play devil's advocate real quick, because we don't have any critics of the measures per se, since Lewis and I are a little more the analysts, and then we have the pro and pro. What I've heard from a lot of folks, which I think applies to both, is that neither of the two ballot measures actually fixes anything. 30 is 7 years, 38 is 12 years, and basically tosses money that will eventually go away. And in that time, there will be little, this is what the critics are saying, in that time, there will be little incentive for anyone to actually, especially you folks in Sacramento, no offense, to actually reform anything, to fix the problems that got us here in the first place. And so that we will feel good that we either won't have the cuts or we will have some more money down the road for education. But in 12 years, that money goes away. In 7 years, that money goes away. And in the meantime, nothing happens to fix it. And I think it raises a good point. I'm not sure that people are willing to risk this next year and the massive cuts that would come if Prop 30 doesn't pass, or if 38 doesn't pass, if either of them don't pass, I'm not sure people are willing to throw the few years of school children under the bus to get the reform. But I think it raises a good point that you put money, you put a Band-Aid on it with this money.
But it's going to come back.
But it comes back, right?
A couple of things. Number one, we haven't done enough, but we are engaged in reform. This year we passed comprehensive pension reform. We are working, as you know, I had a big bill this year to get away from the stereotypical teaching to the test, so that we have an incentive to broaden, curriculum. But the idea, it's a little bit of a catch-22, because if the argument is you should make the taxes permanent instead of temporary, people are already reluctant to vote for a tax increase of any kind. And our economic growth in this state is not fast enough, but it is fairly steady now.
Senator,
yeah,
I hate to cut you off.
That's okay.
The big question I have right now, because we're getting ready to close up, is if these measures don't pass, what happens? Where are we?
Let me start.
Yep.
We will see $6 billion of automatic trigger cuts that will include the school year, this school year being reduced by 2 to 3 weeks. We will see $1 billion of cuts cumulatively to the California's higher education system, and we won't have a balanced budget.
Louis?
Well, I think it means California is going to fall further behind the rest of the country. We're already way behind. The gap is getting bigger and bigger. If you look at how much we're behind, so it's several $1,000s between what California spends on its kids and the rest of the country. And that's not fair. I mean, why should a kid in California, just because they happen to be born here, be subjected to a less effective education system? And so these propositions really do, they're not going to solve everything, but they are going to help.
Arun, did you have anything?
Well, I think you're right. These propositions aren't going to solve everything, but Prop 38 could solve a lot if it's passed. Again, we're talking about 12 years, and we're talking about a problem that is deep and structural in California that is also deeply entwined with the future of our economy.
Thanks to my guests for joining us.